One of the things that I was thinking about with the book of Ruth, that what kinds of things would you consider challenging, let's say a congregation? If you were the pastor, or if you were in a Sunday school context, teaching a Sunday school, what kinds of walkaways would you come up with from this book? What would be some things? I mean, the book of Ruth, it's a lot of people are familiar with the book of Ruth, and, it's like, oh, this love story. That's really all they know about the book of Ruth. Do you have a comment there?
Generally, in my background, when it comes to Ruth, is always, you hear people praying for that Boaz to come show the rescue, the damsel from her situation. I usually try to point to God's faithfulness, and even the bigger idea that God would use somebody like a Moab, someone that had no rights in the temple, someone they're not supposed to deal with, and include someone like that in the lineage of Christ and this bigger idea of how God includes. Yeah. So generally that's my thing. And then just seeing it within the middle of Judges, like you were saying earlier, that all this craziness is going on in Judges. Yeah. Here's a story of people just doing what was right.
Yeah.
And try to remind people that it's going to look crazy right now. Yeah. There are people in the metroplex that are doing what is right.
There you go. I mean, not to be, I'm not to be political or anything, but we still have this sense of chaos in our own country. And a lot of people are on edge and nervous about, I just don't know what to do. And I'm throwing, I just want to go dig a hole and hide. But, really, though, you've got Boaz. He's in the midst of chaos, and he's doing what's faithful and what's right. And look how the Lord responds to him, and how he is extending kindness to those around and bringing in this case, the orphan, and dealing with the widow situations in his community. These are the kinds of things that we see Boaz doing. And even at Ruth's interesting, micro-theological focus in and of her own self. So, like Joseph, when, only Joseph being an Israelite, going to a foreign land and remaining faithful, right? And how the Lord was with him, and the Lord provided for him, and how he rose up in terms of his consistent behavior, and how his status was elevated as the Lord continued to raise him in terms of his Egyptian context. Now we have a non-Israelite entering into the Israelite community, and how the Lord is doing the same thing with Ruth. Her integrity is coming with her. Her name, her reputation is preceding her. And now the Lord is slowly elevating her in terms of her status. Here's another application that I thought of in terms of challenging your congregation. I think I'm thinking of a sermon title, Be Like Boaz or something. But how are our churches postured to receive the orphans and the widows and the aliens in our communities? Are we drawing lines are we drawing lines in the sand? This is, it's a crazy picture. You see the line drawn in the sand there. The disparity between, in this case, the wealthy and the not wealthy, or the poor. Are there fences? Are there strong barbed wire fences being, put in the sand here? Are there gates? Is there exchange? Are people over here asking those people, to join their dinner table? Those kinds of things. How are our churches doing at this? And a challenge, I guess, that would come from the book of Ruth would be Boaz and watch what happens. How's that? And you can challenge your congregations to be like Boaz and opening up your own dinner table to the people in your community. Not just when church is open for operation. It's not about bringing necessarily people to our church building. That might not be the first good step. We talk about this all the time, but I think Ruth, the story of Ruth, and particularly with the focus on Boaz, it's mostly about Ruth, but really it's a story about Boaz and his faithfulness and his fidelity. And he really is he embodies the fullness of who Israel should have been like in those days. Israel should have been like Boaz corporately, but they weren't. There's still little Boazes around. So again, despite the chaos around us, currently in our day, we need to be challenging our people to be like Boaz, because you can still have this kind of impact, and even if it's chaotic and somewhat dangerous all around, I don't know how dangerous it's going to be even in our own country, but maybe we've got a little bit of a time of breathing room, but persecution could come our way more intensely for the church. In fact, that might not be a bad thing. I'm still on that one, persecution in our own country. Because Boaz was doing this despite, I'm sure he would have been receiving some pushback in his day. Although it's not in the text, I'm just speculating. But, what are our churches doing to create the safe havens for the orphans and widows and the aliens in and around our community? So, that's a little aside there. Let's go back to chapter 2 and pick up in verse 15. So let's go down through verse 15 through 23. Let's see, who am I going to pick on now? Let's have Abel over here. Could you read for us? Yeah, starting in verse 15 down through verse 23.
Okay. When she got up to gather grain, Boaz ordered his young men, let her even gather grain among the bundles and don't humiliate her. Pull out some stalks from the bundles for her and leave them for her to gather. Don't rebuke her. So Ruth gathered the grain in the field until evening. She beat out what she had gathered, and it was about 26 quarts of barley. She picked up the grain and went into the town where her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. Then she brought out what she had left over from her mill and gave it to her. Then when her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you gather the barley today? Where did you work? May the Lord bless the man who noticed you." Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man she had worked with and said, "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, for he has not forsaken his kindness in living for the dead." Naomi continued, "The man is a close relative, and he is one of our family's redeemers." Ruth the Moabite said, He also told me, "Stay with my young men until they have finished all their harvest." So Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "My daughter, it is good for you to work with his female servants, so that nothing will happen to you in another field." Ruth stayed close to Boaz's female servants and gathered grain and barley and wheat and harvest were finished. And she lived with her mother.
All right, well, there's a lot of details here. It's interesting how the fidelity and the loyalty of Boaz continues to shine forth, and you see it in the details of the text. In verse 20, Naomi finally catches up with the fact of who this person is, Boaz, and you see that his reputation there in verse 20 is providing for may he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead. So this idea that in Naomi's words, living, of course, Boaz's provision for Naomi and Ruth, aka still living, but even for the dead, that is the household of Elimelech. He's providing for the household of Elimelech. And the disclosure here, once she recognizes who he is, she recognizes that he's one of our closest kinsmen or relatives. The idea there is that the kinsman redeemer idea, as we'll talk about that. Now we see the provision also in the translation is an ephah of barley. I know the difficulty is knowing exactly how much that is in ephah, and the experts go different directions, but it's a lot of grain, probably about 30 to 50 pounds. So what's interesting about that is that, here we've got Ruth carrying that home. I go out, and I know it doesn't look like it, but I work out at the Y, and when I go to the Y and work out, there's some of these women who probably could pull off carrying 30 to 50 pounds of barley home. That was a joke anyway. But Ruth's, she's in pretty good shape for this. So the Lord's providing chesed to Ruth in this provision. Covenant grace is being extended to Naomi and Ruth through providing through this portion of, providing for the gleaning of the field and all of that's going on. Now, Naomi again mentions this kinsman redeemer role of Boaz. Let's remind ourselves of where that comes from in the teaching of Moses. Let's turn to Leviticus chapter 25. It's in a couple places anyway. Leviticus chapter 25, beginning in verse 25. This is the redemption idea. It involves continual provision for the household. It involved land and property, and it involved legal, the transaction of this. That would be a continual provision for the household. So the kinsman would be the one to step in, the closest family relative, male, who would step in and deal with these legal proceedings for the continual provision for the land and for the property of those who were left behind, in this case the widow who is left behind. And then you see that in verse 23. The land, moreover, shall not be sold permanently. For the land is mine, and you are but aliens and sojourners with me. Thus for every piece of your property you are to provide for the redemption of the land. If a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor, he has to sell part of his property, then his nearest kinsman is to come. That's the kinsman idea. And buy back what his relative has sold. Or, in the case of a man who has no kinsman, but so recovers his means as to find sufficient for its redemption, then he shall calculate the year since its sale and refund the balance to the man to whom he sold it, and so return his property. So that's the idea with regards to the land. Let's keep going down to verse 30. Likewise, if a man sells a dwelling house in a walled city, then his redemption right remains valid until a full year from its sale. His right of redemption lasts a full year, but if it is not bought back for him within the space of a full year, then the house that is in the walled city passes permanently to its purchaser. Throughout his generations, it does not revert in the Jubilee, or the year of Jubilee. Over a couple chapters, in chapter 27, verses 47 through okay, I messed up on that. Sorry about that. All right, let's keep moving on. So this kinsman redeemer role functions a little broader in terms of what was going on. So we saw a little bit of it there. To ensure the property of the clan or the household to stay with the household. Number 2, to ensure the freedom of members of the clan who have been sold into slavery or servitude. Number 3, to execute justice on behalf of the clan. So if there's judicial issues that need to be resolved. Also to represent the household in judicial situations. So the kinsman role, according to law, was broad and comprehensive. So basically a legal protector. You might think of it that way. It's interesting that nowhere in the biblical text do we see the kinsman role linked to marrying the widow of the deceased person. That's not a part of the kinsman idea. This is a separate concept in the biblical text. So let's take a look at that idea. And sometimes the kinsman-redeemer idea gets confused with the levirate marriage idea, which is in Deuteronomy chapter 25. Let's take a look at that. Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10. So this is a levirate marriage idea in chapter 25, beginning in verse 5. When brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as a wife and perform the duty of the husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name means reputation, right, as well, of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out from Israel. But if the man does not desire to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate of the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to establish a name for his brother in Israel. He is not willing to perform the duty of the husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall summon him and speak to him. And if he persists and says, I do not desire to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the sight of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And she shall declare, thus it is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. All right, so this is a serious matter. Provision for the household. What happens if a household is on the brink of extinction? So there were laws that were in place to continue the name and the reputation of the first, the head of the household. Should he die and tragically not have a firstborn son to move in and take that role? That's a separate issue, this one, from the kinsman idea. Now what's interesting about the book of Ruth is how both of those ideas kind of come into play and kind of fill Boaz in terms of his tank. He's going to act as the kinsman, but this levirate marriage idea also is brought in a little bit later and combined with that idea. We'll see that in the text. So it seems that Boaz begins as the kinsman redeemer, so that first idea, acting on behalf of the widow Naomi. But later, and dare we say, because of his love for Ruth, the levirate marriage idea comes as a secondary idea a little bit later on. The question is whether Boaz, this is the question that we ask, and it's kind of subtly hid maybe, but not as, it's the love idea in Boaz. This picture is kind of the Hallmark card version of the book of Ruth. But the question we have to seriously ask is, Boaz acting as a kinsman out of obligation to his covenant duty and responsibility before anything with regards to the gushy-wishy stuff that we call love. He's acting loyally, right? He's acting on behalf of what he knows is the right thing to do in the situation based on what we have in terms of Moses' teaching. So a lot of, we jump right into the book of Ruth and we think, oh, it's a love story, blah, blah, blah. But really, though, we don't want to lose track of the fact that he's acting primarily driven by, his integrity with regards to what he knows is the right thing to do. So, the love thing probably comes later as a secondary bonus feature. But primarily, the initial action, he's applying, this kinsman, he's acting as a kinsman, and the levirate marriage idea comes a little later. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 2. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? And now is not Boaz our kinsman, with whose maid you were? Behold, he winnows barley at the threshing floor tonight. So let's see, that's all I want to say. So now, what Naomi is struggling with is how is she going to provide for her daughter-in-law, who's acted so loyally and helping her in this situation. So this is where the narrative gets, it gets interesting with regards to what happens next. So let's take a look at verses 2 through 5 in chapter 3. And now is not Boaz our kinsman, with whose maid you were, beholding winnow's barley at the threshing floor tonight. So here's what Naomi instructs Ruth to do. Wash yourself, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. Oh, I forgot the part about putting on perfume, right? But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. And it shall be, when he lies down, that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet, lie down, and then he'll tell you what to do. And she said to her, all that you say I will do. All right, let's just pause here and think about this. What are we supposed to think about a mother-in-law instructing her daughter, her daughter-in-law, to take a bath, put on perfume, and then, in the dark of night, go to a place where a man would be sleeping and uncover his legs? What is her intent? And interestingly, in that context, threshing floors, these places where the threshing would take place, outside of the city gates, would have been a common meeting place for prostitutes from the city to go out and meet up with the field workers after a long day of working in the field, eating and drinking and merriment and all of that, and everything that happens after. It's interesting. So what are we supposed to think of this? Are Naomi and Ruth thinking of forcing the situation their way by seducing Boaz, right, to have sex with Ruth?
No.
No? I'm trying to build this up and make it into some kind of a soap opera here or something, What's interesting, it's interesting. No, I'm obviously not going that direction either. I think this forces the storyline way out of kilter. It's not what we've seen so far in the activity and the actions and the dialogue of Boaz, certainly, but also with Ruth. What do we know about Boaz to this point? He's a man of chesed. He's a man of chesed. He's a man of grace. He's a man of integrity. Boaz. Naomi knows this about Boaz. That's the thing. See, she knows of Boaz's reputation in the community as a man of integrity. She's not dressing her daughter up as her daughter-in-law as a prostitute with that kind of intent. And also in the details of the Hebrew, Ruth is not uncovering, I'm just going to say it, his genitals in this situation. She's uncovering his feet. All right? It's not in the text. So I'm going to take the noble high road here. And I'm thinking that Naomi is encouraging Ruth to offer herself to Boaz, not as a prostitute, but as a solution to the Levirate marriage option that's also in Israelite law. Ruth's posture and proximity to Boaz in the night, and at this particular place actually puts Ruth in a position also. Ruth going to this location also is, you might say, this might be a stretch, but is protecting Boaz also from the situation. And her being there, present and in proximity, in a way, perhaps chasing off other potential prostitutes who might be coming in and seeking other motives for Boaz. So this is she's not come for sex. She's come to extend, Ruth has come to extend chesed to Boaz. And if we just keep going here, we see that come out in the details of the dialogue that takes place. So she went down to the threshing floor, verse 6. And she did according to all that her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten, and when his heart was merry, he wasn't stone cold drunk. I think he was just enjoyed a meal and all of that. He went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. She came secretly and uncovered his feet and lay down. And it happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled, and he bent forward, and behold, the woman was lying at his feet, and he said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, and because you are a close relative." So here's where the intersection of the kinsman. It's the idea in the close relative idea. You are a kinsman, but now Ruth is offering herself and recognizing the Levirate marriage option as well. Now it hasn't happened yet. Verse 10. Then he said, "May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last chesed to be better than the first, by not going after young men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. And now it is true, I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. So, remain this night. And when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good. Let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you, as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, and she rose before one could recognize another. And he said, "Let it be not known that the woman came to the threshing floor." Let's pause there for just a minute. So, verse 9 offers the clue to unlock this delicate scene. "I am Ruth, your maid. Spread your covering over your maid, so because you are a kinsman redeemer." So the Hebrew here can mean garment. We've already seen this idea of spreading out over with regards in reference to the wings. The wings idea, I think that's what we have back in chapter 2, verse 12. Let's remind ourselves of that. "May the Lord reward your work, and the wages be full from the Lord, your God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." I think that we need to kind of bring those two texts together in this idea of extending over or covering over is really a reference to chesed. Extend your chesed and cover this situation with your covenant grace. And we see that even in the details of this text. Ruth offers herself as wife to Boaz. She asks him to marry her. I think that's what's going on here. As an offering. There's no consummation of this that night. The posture was, Ruth is saying, "I'm here, I'm available, and if this helps you extend chesed to me, I'm here to extend chesed to you." And she asks, so that's the idea of the extension. And I think our interpretation is only strengthened by how Boaz responds. He doesn't curse her. He doesn't treat her like a wayward prostitute here. He offers a blessing right there in the text. He recognizes her noble character. And this is Ruth's noble character that's been consistent, right, through the whole narrative. She's risen to the top because she's not hobnobbed with nobility. She's not given herself to other men. She's not climbed the corporate ladder. She's like Joseph. She's been faithful and consistent to do the right thing, and the Lord has opened doors for her and caused her success. So we need to remind ourselves that in the wider context of the book of Judges, this is a 400-year period of spiritual chaos, where everyone was doing whatever was right in their own eyes. So Boaz and Ruth embody the covenant loyalty that should have permeated the entire Israelite community. So Boaz cuts to the chase. He's a man of integrity. He recognizes that there's a closer kinsman redeemer. And Boaz's positive response hinges on the legal transaction that needs to take place. So he's the second in line kinsman And Ruth needs to wait until morning before she finds out the verdict. So that's where we are. Verses 14 and 15. So let's look at that. So she lay at his feet until morning and rose before one could recognize another. That's at, daybreak. It's still a little dark. And he said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." Again, he said, "Give me the cloak that is on you and hold it." So she held it, and he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her, and she went into the city. All right. So here's an exchange where I think the intent is to protect the reputation of both Ruth and Boaz, both his reputation and hers. Let's wake up early. He sends her off with more grain, so he's continuing to provide for Naomi. And he leaves and goes to town to prepare for whatever the legal matters that are going to take place later that day. So verses 16 through 18. "And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, 'How did it go, my daughter?'" That's Naomi. And Ruth told her all that the man had done for her. And she said, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me. For he said, 'Do not go to your mother-in-law empty-handed.' Then she said, Naomi, 'Wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest until he has settled it today.'" Again, that's just confirmation, I think, that is in full view of Boaz's reputation. She knew how he was going to treat her before sending her to that threshing floor. He knew, she knew, Naomi knew, this is a man of integrity. He acts in consistency with who I know who he is. I know this man, Boaz. So I'm sending you to him. There's this potential for him to maybe want to extend chesed to you as a kinsman, but also this Levirate marriage is in the back corner. So go offer yourself as an option, and we'll see what happens. But I know he'll treat you well, Naomi. And Ruth follows through with that. Now we have this situation developing. And that's what we see here at the end of chapter 3. All right, so Ruth offers Naomi the report, and this man of character is and no surprise to Naomi, I think, is continuing to respond and act in integrity. All right. So chapter 4, verses 1 through 2. Let's take a look at that. Let's have, Jackson, are you here? There you are. Why don't you read verses 1 and 2.
Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down.
So a little of where this is taking place. This is where archaeology kind of intersects with the biblical text. And I got a few pictures with regards to what this might look like. Boaz goes to the city gate, and going up to the city gate makes sense because a city gate would have been typically placed on a higher elevation with regards to the land around. The city gate and its tower would have been the place for the troops to be stationed so that they could see 360 and any enemies that would be coming into the to try to take over the walled city in this case. So it's a higher elevation. This is the lookout tower for the troops. In the bottom 2 pictures here give more details. This is actually one of our own professors. This is taken at Tel Gezer and at the city gate there. And to the right we see some of the same kinds of designs, and you can see those square type of features over here line up with this particular city gate design. That's an overhead of the Solomonic gate at Megiddo. So they're similar in design and were pretty common that day. These little squared out areas would be basically meeting rooms. They're 7 by 14, 7 feet by 14 feet in design. So not huge rooms, but with a little tight space, you'd fit in about 10 people. And for the soldiers who are at the tower, that'd be nice, cool places to go in the heat of the day if you need to take a little nap or eat lunch or whatever. But also, they had dual purpose. They'd be community meeting rooms. And in this case, it would be where you'd go with the city elders in this case. And that's what we see here going on in this particular narrative with Boaz, gathering 10 city elders, going to this location, grabbing a room, and then rendering a legal decision. And this is what's going on. This is what Boaz is facilitating in this case. In fact, going to the gate is really a synonymous idea as the idea of going to court, because this is where the legal matters were being decided in those days. All right, well, enough of that archaeology. Let's see the courtroom drama start to unfold here, beginning in verse 3. Then Boaz, he said to the closest relative, quote, Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. Now that's the idea. Remember, we looked at the text there in Leviticus that talked about the kinsman role in dealing with the legal matters with regards to the land and in providing for the household. So the initial focus on the kinsman idea, we're not talking about the Levirate marriage idea. It's just all about kinsmen at this point. We got to deal with the land. So I thought, verse 4, to inform you, saying, buy it before those who are sitting here and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me that I may know. For there is no one but you to redeem it. And I, that is Boaz, am after you, kinsman number 1. And he said, I will redeem it. So if the story ended here, we might be a little heartbroken with regards to our Hallmark movie channel ending, but not yet. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth, the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. So now we have the application of the Levirate marriage idea in providing for the name and for the reputation of the deceased husband of Naomi. It's not just about genealogy, it's about the name and the reputation. So that status of the household of Elimelech needs to be maintained in the community as well. And the closest relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. You may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it. So he's giving it up to Boaz. Verse 7. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the redemption and the exchange of land to confirm any matter. A man removed his sandal and gave it to another. And this was the matter of attestation in Israel. So the closest relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself. And he removed his sandal. See, the author in verse 7 gives a little narrative explanation of the whole removing of sandal idea and explaining why that happened. That's kind of a way of symbolizing the closing of a legal decision or a matter, is you remove your sandal. Kind of odd, but that's the way they did it. That's the way in verse 7 of sealing the deal. So this is verse 5. We saw that Boaz points out the land is also going to come with a widow, Ruth. And in an interesting turn of events, but we've seen the Lord's hand at work all the way through the narrative. The kinsman announces that he cannot redeem the land if it must come with Ruth. So he relinquishes that right to Boaz. In verse 7, the removing of the sandal, the author is saying, hey, let me explain this to you, in case you didn't understand. This is what's going on here. But then we see the unnamed kinsman's primary concern will center on the fact that he's married. You know, he's not an unmarried kinsman. So he's recognizing this and explaining this. The Levirate marriage text would probably have been applied to an unmarried kinsman. So this kind of pecking order idea. We do have a precedent in Numbers chapter 27, verses 9 through 11. We won't turn there, but the idea is if the first kinsman in line is already married, maybe the preference would go to the unmarried kinsman. In terms of the application of the Levirate marriage law in Deuteronomy 25. So I think that's what might be going on here. So this is not unprecedented. In other words, we can't blame the first kinsman here for making this decision and relinquishing his right. I think he had the right to do so if he saw standing before him kinsman number 2. So this was okay. And the elders, of course, are going to recognize this as well. But really what's more at stake in this transaction, the line of Elimelech, his name, his reputation. And it's interesting, Boaz is concerned about that. I don't think we see really any of his concern other than being integrity, demonstrating integrity with regards to his chesed and his commitment to doing the right covenant thing. He's now the kinsman providing for the household of Elimelech. And we've got, we've talked about Naomi. She's past child-rearing age, and Ruth, Elimelech's Moabite daughter-in-law. I mean, Boaz represents here his concern for the name of the dead. We saw that before in Naomi's words. More than just the genealogy. I think Boaz is concerned for the name and the reputation of the deceased in this case. The name and reputation of Elimelech is Boaz's concern. And that shouldn't surprise us because we don't know much about Elimelech. Maybe he was like Boaz. He had a name. He had a reputation in the community in and around Bethlehem at that time. So maybe that's what's going on here as well. Let's see here. I mean, again, we can think about how to apply this to our youth group, our congregation. I was thinking of, something that, in working with teens, some of the struggles that teenagers have is, why should I do the right thing in school when everybody else is doing whatever was right in their own eyes? It's almost a little microcosm of the book of Judges. If we have, even in Christian school, it's no different. I mean, Christian kids can do whatever they can do whatever is right in their own eyes as well. Sometimes it's tough there because everybody's supposed to be doing what is right in the eyes of the Lord, but that doesn't always happen. So it's a little bit of a challenge. But the idea is challenging our youth to act consistently and in integrity. We have a great illustration of that in the character and the activity of Boaz. All right, so let's just keep going here. Verses 9 through 12. We're almost to the end here. And then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, so this is legal language, "You are witnesses today that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Moreover, I have acquired Ruth, the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife, in order to raise up the name of the deceased of his inheritance." That's the Levirate marriage. "So that the name of the deceased may not be cut off from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today." And all the people who were in the court and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel. And may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord shall give you by this young woman." So even from you see this language of blessing, and it just shows that there's here, at least in this particular scene, a group of people who are acting with integrity in response. So Boaz picks the baton up and settles the deal. Now he's acting as kinsman, but he's also providing through the law of the Levirate marriage and preserving the name and reputation of Elimelech. Ruth will now be his wife, in verse 10. So all of this happens. It's hard to pin down really where love is. Where's the love in this narrative? Where does it show up? How soon, how early do we know? Were they in love? Or is Boaz only acting in terms of the cold, letter of the law? It's hard to say. We see the word love coming up here in a little bit. But the name and reputation of the dead will be maintained. And it seems like that was the important thing for Boaz in dealing with and properly providing for Naomi. The elders affirm the transaction with a blessing to Ruth and an affirmation, which basically this affirmation functions the idea, we are witnesses. Basically, yes, it's done. It's the idea. We are witnesses is the idea of saying yes. Actually, yeah. So this blessing is really extraordinary. It requests that Ruth, and over here with reference to may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, is really kind of extraordinary. These would be the matriarchs of Israel, Rachel, Leah, and also we see Tamar, who like Ruth, come into the household of Judah, that is Tamar, but under much different circumstances. So we're going to have a little bit of comparison of Genesis 38, if we go back to Judah and Tamar, that situation, and the situation with Ruth and Boaz. In fact, Boaz might be seen as a foil, the idea of being kind of an opposite to Judah. It is interesting. It indicates that maybe the author of Ruth is writing his account with Genesis 38 in kind of as a backdrop, you might say. And if we recall from Genesis 38, we saw there, if you remember, that the application of the Levirate marriage idea was being mishandled and avoided, right? If you remember that. And Tamar was being ignored multiple times. Judah withheld his chesed, right? He didn't apply his chesed. Boaz, in contrast, extends his chesed. So what is true in both contexts, the Lord obviously is operating behind the scenes and working on his fidelity only through the faithfulness of the few. Let's just take a look. I've kind of put this together. I just threw this together. I don't know how common this is, and this might be overstating. I hope not. Might be. Don't break a church up over this. But Tamar and Ruth, if you just compare, both accounts, the Levirate marriage idea is front and center. In both cases, where if you remember, Tamar is ignored and time passes, but Ruth is recognized from the start as time passes. She's not ignored. She's recognized for who she is through the entire account, her name and her reputation. If you remember, Tamar, she's going to resort to drastic measures to get the attention of the significant males in her life. As a prostitute. Do you remember that? All right. Ruth, on the other hand, she must, maybe I said it too strongly. She does resort to drastic measures. I mean, sending her up to the threshing floor and all that. But if you understand that Naomi's doing that, knowing full well the reputation of Boaz on the other end. But to get the attention of a particular male, and I'm going to probably just, etch that off because I don't think she's going as a prostitute. I made that case earlier. I think she's going and presenting herself as a very welcome sight, but as, the Levirate marriage idea is a potential possibility. So that's what we have going on there. Interestingly, in contrast, Tamar is recognized as a prostitute. She's seen for who she's not. But Ruth, in contrast, is recognized as a woman of noble character. She's seen for who she is. I think I said that right. So there's contrast there. Significant contrast. So if you want to do if you're educating a Sunday school, maybe a women's conference or a Sunday school class that focuses on women, this is an interesting little study here in terms of the contrast of those two. And then finally, the Levirate law is enacted on manipulation, in contrast to the Levirate law is enacted on loyalty and character in the Ruth narrative. So I think that's pretty accurate. I didn't have a lot of time to think about that in great detail, but just wanted to pull out a few things between those two accounts. All right, we're getting close to the end, and so the contract. So we see that contrast between Ruth and Tamar, Boaz, and Judah in the two accounts. So let's wrap up in chapter 4, verses 13 down through verse 17. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he consummated the marriage, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse, and the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. So the author now finally brings the narrative to a conclusion. So the climax here occurs, obviously, 9 months later, in the home of Boaz and Ruth. Time passes, and a child is born. There we go. A child is born. So it's interesting, in so many previous narratives, the miraculous occurs with the right theology applied to the idea of this child of promise. This is the Lord's hand is involved in this, and it's there in the text. The Lord's the fulfillment of the divine agenda. On the backdrop of Naomi's initial complaint, if you remember that back in chapter 1, verses 20 through 21, Naomi said, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." Now we have the full, just like in the book of Job. For Naomi, now her plate is full. And that comes through in the dialogue here of the women of the city. And they come and celebrate Naomi. So if her life was once emptied by God, now it's certainly full. And that's what we have in the emphasis. This is a reversal. That, like I said, that reminds us of the book of Job. In the reference here, in terms of Ruth. Ruth, for Naomi, is better than having 7 sons. That was something. Because in that culture, we've seen that having sons as a provision for the household, you needed a lot of sons around, to provide for the ongoing security of the household and all of that. But the Lord has provided Naomi a daughter-in-law, not just any old daughter-in-law, right? He's provided Ruth. There's a message there I was thinking about this morning for how a father could... I'm thinking about doing this with my own daughter, actually. So hi, Hannah, if you ever watch this, I might send her a link to this. But the idea of how much of blessing... I'm thinking of how you can honor your daughter and help her see how much of a blessing she is, in terms of this little mini scene here with how much of a blessing, an amplified blessing, Ruth was to Naomi as a daughter-in-law, as a daughter. So Ruth here, in terms of providing for the shalom, for the welfare to Naomi, is better than 7 sons, and is being recognized by the community in terms of her integrity and her faithfulness and her fidelity. And in the hands of the Lord, the Lord's hand at work behind the scenes. So all of this. Ruth embodies the love, the loyalty that's called for by Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. Do you remember that? Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. After the Shema in verse 4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. So I think Ruth here stands right there in terms of what does it look like? What is that loyalty? What does that covenant faith look like? Well, let's just look to Ruth. So Ruth now is another representation of what that looks like. She's a walking billboard of Deuteronomy 6:5. And back on the 7 sons recognition, that was to have 7 sons. That's basically a perfect family. That's another way of saying the idea of 7 in the biblical idea being the number of perfection. So having a perfect family, this community is recognizing that Naomi with Ruth has a perfect family. So that's pretty significant. So Naomi responds and embraces her new role as grandma on the contrast of her losing her husband and her 2 sons. She's now has received back a son and a daughter. So verse 17 places significance on this newborn's role as a continuation of the line of Elimelech. And his name and his reputation, of course, is going to now be transferred into the future to one pretty significant king of name and reputation. That's King David. So the birth of Obed means that he is the grandfather of King David. So this is a significant. And then finally, verses 18 through 22. And again, this is, I think, the thesis statement of the author here. These are the generations of Perez. To Perez born Hezron. To Hezron born Ram. To Ram Aminadab. And to Aminadab was born Nahshon. Nahshon Salmon Boaz. Boaz Obed. And Obed was born Jesse. To Jesse King David. So the author leads us with this genealogy, and he answers the question of how one gets from Judah to David, going all the way back to the patriarch Judah, all the way down to King David. So one last thing here, and then we'll wrap up for the day. So again, back on this idea, this looking back, looking forward idea, and I kind of like this idea the more I think about it. I have to do a quick scan to see how prevalent it is in the commentaries. But the idea of the book of Judges, how these 2 books work together, I think is a kind of a significant thing. Judges, there was no king in Israel. Everybody was doing what was right in his own eyes. 400 years of spiritual chaos. And is God king? The question, is God king? By forgetting God, has Israel dethroned God as king? At least on the earthly representation. The eternal reality of God as king is always true. The question is it earthly true? Is it being expressed and recognized in an earthly representation, God being on his throne? And the author of Judges is saying, no, it was true, and it was supposed to be continually true. And perhaps his question is, when will it be true again? What kind of king do we need? When will the king be rethroned? Ruth is interesting because it comes along and I think builds on the author of Judges' theological question. And he's asking the question of, what about King David? Is King David that king who has brought back that sense? He's now, is he all that there is to the story? And if we see, let's just take a look at 2 Samuel chapter 7 and remind ourselves. We'll talk about this more, obviously, next semester. But when King David is reflecting on the oracle that the prophet Nathan had given him, we call it the Davidic covenant. And you see in David's prayerful response in chapter 7 in 2 Samuel, David the king went in and sat before the Lord, and he said, "Who am I, O Lord? And what is my house that you've brought me this far?" And I think a very significant kind of recognition that King David, he's looking into the distant future with the implications of what was just promised him through Nathan's oracle. Verse 19, "And this was insignificant in your eyes, O Lord, for you have spoken also of the house of your servant concerning the distant future." There's this future sense. And this is the Torah of man. Your translation might go custom or something like that, but it's Torah of man, O Lord God. And again, what more can David say to you? For you know your servant, O Lord God. So there's this distant future idea, I think. And by the time of the writing of Ruth, the author of Ruth may have had, I always say this, I can't prove it, may have had his quiet time reading the Davidic covenant, perhaps. Maybe there's this recognition of, what about that distant future? And you see that the author of Ruth here, in bringing together, out of this 400-year chaos, through the faithfulness of the faithful remnant, and in a microcosm, through the story of Ruth and the story of Boaz and his loyalty extended to a non-Israelite Moabite daughter-in-law, that this will happen. There's this continuation. The genealogical line, King David, and then beyond. So at least an immediate recognition of, here's a fulfillment of some of what the author of Judges was wrestling with. But there's still, I think, lingering this distant future idea that we're still waiting for. When will it be the case that the fullness of God as King will be true for His people, And that's an interesting thing. So I'll leave that with you today, and we'll end our discussion on the book of Ruth. No new material between now and the end of the semester for this class. Next Monday, we'll review, and we'll kind of focus on some of the things that, those high points that I'd like you to be ready for the final exam in this class. And for those of you who came in late, we'll have that full week window to take the final exam online through Blackboard at your convenience. So I hope that'll be a help to you. And we'll get this class wrapped up. And don't forget those extra credit opportunities. If any of you are worried about your point total or anything like that, those are available to you. And the group discussion questions, if you finish those out and do all of them, you'll be getting extra points for those as well. So you're only required to do 10, but I think we'll have up to 14 of them for the semester. Just a few reminders.